Not the same guy. Pascal's wager. This issue is really relevant to Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager informs this discussion. It also informs discussions of Pascal's wager. So we're going to do a quick breakdown of what Pascal's wager is. Blaise Pascal was a Catholic philosopher who said, we have to be completely agnostic on the question of the existence of God. By completely agnostic, he means there are no arguments for or against the existence of God that are any good at all. We can't know philosophically or empirically. So, but we are compelled to choose because the Bible says we are. And it is better to believe that, and be wrong than the alternative. And for some reason, it's better to believe Catholicism and be wrong than any of the other alternatives. He doesn't really go into the whole Muslim issue too much. And then, this is the key one for tonight. By acting as if it is true, one can come to believe that God exists. So we can will ourselves to believe. Pascal doesn't really go into a good explanation of why this is the case, but this is Catholic doctrine, as well as I understand it, that we can fake it till we make it. Hey, you've heard it. Don't laugh. It's taught seriously. Do we have any questions at this point? I mean, we've all run into Pascal's wager, but this is the whole point of it. A lot of people are like, Pascal's wager gets crapped on by atheists all the time, and it should, but a lot of people don't understand that Blaise Pascal has this whole long thing about how none of the arguments for or against God matter. So he has this whole setup to why we have to choose and everything. So it's more interesting than people want to make it out to be, but it's still bad. Ethics, politics, and epistemology. I'm lumping all those three together. Blameworthiness principle, which is important in political theory. People are morally blameworthy only for those actions they perform or those dispositions they acquire voluntarily, and the source for that is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's just what the blameworthiness principle is. It undergirds a lot of our justifications for certain laws, principles that we hold people to in law. So, should we hold people morally responsible for what they believe, just not for what they do? That question is what prompted this entire presentation, because that came up on an AOK page. Somebody on the Facebook page one day was saying, you know, it's morally reprehensible that these people believe what they do about gays. It's morally reprehensible that people believe what they do about Christianity. It's morally reprehensible that what these people believe about hell. Is it? That's a question we're here to look at. We have to turn that back on ourselves. We can make fun of them for their doctrine of hell thing too, but we also have to ask ourselves if we're going to be consistent on this. Do we hold people morally blameworthy for the beliefs that they have? So, and can it be unethical to hold false beliefs? We're gonna set up some foundational arguments for that. We're not going to go into too deeply on it, but we're going to set up some of the main arguments for and against. Implications for the blameworthiness principle. Mill, John Stuart Mill, and Benedict Spinoza, two of the big name Enlightenment philosophers who both went in very different directions with their ethics, but were both major figures in the Enlightenment, both argued that because we're not directly responsible for our beliefs, we have to be tolerant of what people believe, because people are not responsible for what they believe. And they built a whole ethical system around that. And then one of the examples for what they argue for, state cannot ethically compel a person to hear the evidence. Or they can ethically compel a person to hear the evidence for a claim, but not to believe any particular conclusion. So, for example, our jury system is built around that. You know, you can't, we don't hold jurors ethically responsible for the decisions that they make as long as they listen to the evidence. Free will comes up in this conversation all the time. I don't know why. I wish Chaz were here so I could throw things at him because he always brings it up. But this is from the Wikipedia page on free will. This is their little breakdown of the 4 different approaches to free will. The top line is, if you're on the right side, you believe there's free will. If you're on the left side, you believe there isn't. If you're on the top, you believe that reality is fundamentally determined. If you're on the bottom, you believe reality is fundamentally indeterminate. These are the 4 harder positions you can take. People can be fuzzy on the line, but those are the 4 corners. Libertarian, not political libertarianism, free will libertarianism. Free will libertarians say that reality, free will exists, hard determinism, that things are not determined. We really do have like this kind of quasi-mystical free will. I think the libertarian free will people are just as silly as political libertarians. You can quote me on that. Compatibilists believe that free will exists. The idea of free will is compatible with the idea that we are not really, I mean, we're fundamentally determined. That you can still hold people ethically responsible, that the blameworthiness principle is still compatible with that. I tend to fall into the compatibilist camp. The other 2 no free will groups are hard determinists and hard indeterminists. You almost never run into any of these people. Usually you run into the hard determinists who think for some reason that because everything is determined that free will doesn't exist. That's Sam Harris. His whole book on free will is arguing from that top left corner. Oh goodness, it's not showing up. Oh crap. Okay, well, all right. This chart is a whole breakdown of a survey from the philosophy papers. They did a survey of professional philosophers about their philosophical views on a whole range of topics. And unfortunately, I don't have, damn it. Sorry guys, it didn't transfer onto the slide. But that shouldn't happen for more than this slide and this slide. Anyway, what the survey shows is that most philosophers are compatibilists. Most philosophers strongly accept compatibilism. Daniel Dennett, for example, is one of these people. He has a whole book on arguing for compatibilism called All the Free Will Worth Learning. The smaller groups are incompatibilists. And I've got a little jab at Sam Harris down there in the corner. It doesn't make much sense because you can't see the chart, but it says that over 94% of surveyed philosophers don't agree with his particular stance. And then the top 10 most correlated results, which you can't see for some reason, number 6 and number 7 are correlating belief in libertarian free will with belief in the existence of God and non-naturalism. And the correlation is not super high, but the way they did their math, it's higher than it looks. So it turns out that most people who are libertarians about free will are also incompatible. So anyway, that's not super relevant because what's the relevance of free will to whether beliefs are chosen? I don't think it's very relevant. Those who deny free will exists still believe that conscious choices exist. They just don't believe those choices are free. That's Sam Harris. The question remains whether those beliefs are the kind of thing that are chosen. And then here's the quote from Sam Harris that's relevant to this question. When we consider human behavior, the difference between premeditated voluntary action and mere accident seems immensely consequential. I agree. This distinction could be reserved without banishing the ideal of free will. I agree with that, which is why I'm a compatibilist. I don't understand why Sam Harris isn't, but that's what. Even if you don't believe free will, all I'm arguing here is even if you don't believe free will exists, you still believe that people have premeditated voluntary actions. The question then becomes, is belief a premeditated voluntary action? Voluntary being the relevant question. So, direct versus indirect voluntary control. Now at this point, recognizing that I screwed up with a couple of slides, do we have any major questions? Am I losing anybody? We're all good. Go to advanced here. Okay, this is where we're going to get into the arguments. Direct versus indirect voluntary control. Assuming your brain's working right, and you choose to perform actions that will happen immediately, the things over which you have the choice, or what we'll call direct voluntary control. So, for example, I have direct voluntary control because nobody is preventing me or making me choose whether or not to pick up my phone. I picked up my phone, that's something over which I have direct voluntary control. Now, I can't speak Japanese, but I could choose to learn to speak Japanese. That's something over which I have indirect voluntary control. It's a choice you can take that will eventually lead to the desired outcome. For example, learning to play an instrument, practicing something now that leads to an ability later, that's indirect voluntary control. These are important distinctions because the argument is over direct voluntary control of beliefs, not indirect. Here's why. Direct stochastic voluntarism, or direct voluntary control of beliefs, addresses the question, to what extent, if any, do people have direct voluntary control over their beliefs? Indirect stochastic voluntarism addresses the question, to what extent, if any, do people have indirect voluntary control over their beliefs? We'll do indirect first because it's the least controversial. I don't know of any philosophers that don't agree that indirect voluntary control of our beliefs is true. For example, when I walked into this room, the lights were out. I believed that if I went over and hit that little switch over there on the wall, the lights would come on. And I went over and hit the little switch on the wall and the lights came on. And they did. So I had indirect voluntary control over my belief that the lights were on in this room. Does that make sense? It's something over which I have indirect control, not direct control. Imagine you walk in the room, lights off. Okay, I gave that example. If you have direct voluntary control over the evidence, you have indirect voluntary control over the belief. That's important. We'll look at that in a second. This has relevance, for example, for religious beliefs. Okay, this is an example of a belief over which Christians say we have indirect voluntary control. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. So, they believe that if you pray for something and you wish for it hard enough, then you will get it. And that's something over which you have indirect voluntary control. That's the whole premise behind intercessory prayer. It's something over which you have indirect voluntary control. Another example of this, how many of you have heard of The Secret? Any Oprah fans in here? And the whole premise behind The Secret is you just believe it hard, wish for it hard enough, and act as if it's true. Fake it till you make it, you'll get that bicycle. Not kidding, that's what the video says. The interesting thing is this does not include beliefs about the veridical nature of the Bible. In other words, whether or not the Bible is true is not something over which Christians believe you have indirect voluntary control. Or the truth of The Secret, whether or not the claims of The Secret are true is not something that the fans of The Secret believe you have control over. Or the existence of God. So regardless of whether or not you have indirect voluntary control over the ability to gain things, or prayer, or curing diseases, you don't have voluntary control over whether or not the claims about the ability to do those things is true. So, any questions about that indirect stochastic voluntarism before we go on? Does everyone agree that indirect stochastic voluntarism is true? Do we have any questions about that? It's just accepted. Okay, all right. Get some blanks here. Don't be afraid to go, I don't get it, I have a question. 4 main arguments against direct stochastic voluntarism. We're going to move over into direct voluntary control here. The 4 main arguments, there's classic argument, empirical belief argument, and intentional acts argument are all arguments about the conceptual possibility. That's an important idea in philosophy. It just means, does the idea make sense? Is it even conceptually possible? Is it something we can conceive of being true? The contingent inability argument just says, yeah, it doesn't matter if it's conceptually possible, it's just not empirically true. It's just evidentiarily false. So we're going to look at one of the conceptual arguments and one of the empirical arguments. I'm not going to go into all of them because it takes a while to break them down. We'll look at the first conceptual argument first, the empirical acts argument. It was written by, I'm going to butcher this guy's name, Dion Scott Cougarez, and he wrote this paper in 1994. It's hidden behind pay firewalls, so I can't get to it. So I'm going from the Internet Encyclopedia article. Internet Encyclopedia Philosophy's breakdown of the article. He argues that direct stochastic voluntarism, which means direct control over our beliefs, is conceptually impossible. He analyzes the nature of intentional acts in this argument. Intentional acts argument. If direct stochastic voluntarism is true, then believing in in an act that is under people's direct, then believing is an act that is under your voluntary control. That's the first premise of his argument. That's not controversial. Any act that is under a person's direct voluntary control is guided and monitored by intention. That's not particularly controversial either. It just means to voluntarily believe something, you have to have an intention to do so. The one in black here, acquiring a belief, however, is different. It is by its very nature not the kind of act that can be guided and monitored by an intention. We'll have to do some unpacking on that one. And then he says, thus, acquiring a belief is not under a person's direct voluntary control. Therefore, direct stochastic voluntarism is conceptually impossible. And then, intentional acts argument. Why should we think acquiring a belief is not the kind of act that is guided by intention? So why should we believe that the black one here is true? Let's give some examples. I wish Damien were here already. Damien wants to believe that God exists. He has a strong desire to believe that God exists. Damien has a perspective about the world. This perspective includes other beliefs, desires, systems of viewing things, frameworks, that kind of stuff. This perspective that Damien holds is incompatible with belief in a God. As long as Damien maintains this perspective, he can't form a belief that God exists. Any person who wants to will to believe a proposition faces this situation. The perspective the person has of the world will not allow him or her to form an intention that is compatible with the belief he or she wants to form. And so that's the breakdown of the argument for why this is true. And if this is true, then this is true. It's just a standard deductive argument. Does anybody see any problems with this before we advance to the arguments against it?
I have something that's consistent with it.
Go ahead.
I can't provide an attribution for this, but I've watched a lot of Sam Harris videos, and there's one quote of his that stuck out. It's something that he said where when one is seeing the evidence and is convinced by the evidence, one believes helplessly.
Right.
It's like it's not something we voluntarily choose to do. It's just like we're convinced. It's like that makes sense, and we believe it.
That would be, you're right. That's Harris's attempt to articulate essentially what he is saying. That believing, that choosing to believe something involves an intention to do it. And we can't form an intention to do it. We can't really form an intention to do it because of the perspective we have about the world. We don't have control over that intention. We have a set of, go ahead.
I don't think that's accurate. Like when we discover new scientific discoveries, they force us to shift away from our old framework. So we have to make a conscious decision to say, no, I'm not going to believe this evidence anymore in light of new information. You can do the same thing with any two opposite beliefs. You can say, well, I would rather believe that this God exists, and I'm going to wipe away all the scientific evidence because it doesn't cohere with what I want to believe.
See, guy whose name I can't pronounce his belief is that you're not actually forming an intention to change your beliefs, you're coming to believe it by the force of the evidence. But it's not something that, a scientific example, overwhelming evidence forces you to change your mind, but it's not something you form an intention to change your mind. You just change your mind regardless of your desire to or not to do so.
Coming to a realization, if you will. It just happened.
Right. That would be one possible response. So let's look at, that's something along the lines of what you're saying is a common objection. Okay, objections. Consider Damien. Damien might be ignorant of the standards for and against God's existence. He might still understand the proposition. This is a common objection to this particular example. Damien might be ignorant of the standard arguments for and against God's existence. He still might understand the proposition God exists and have a pragmatic desire to believe. He then reads Pascal. He might then form the intention to believe. By reading Pascal and becoming convinced that, because Pascal has this whole section in there that if you fake it, then you'll come to believe. This is nothing in his perspective that prevents, there is nothing in his perspective that prevents him from believing. Therefore, direct stochastic voluntarism is not conceptually impossible. That's the standard objection to that particular argument by religious people. So the idea is that for questions over which someone doesn't have good evidence one way or the other, that's where it matters. You have to not have good evidence one way or the other, and you then have to form an intention to believe, and if you have nothing that's preventing you from combining the intention to believe with the lack of evidence, then you can come to believe. And I don't think this is a compelling objection. I think your objection is probably better than this one, but that's the standard philosophical objection. We'll move on to the next argument against. This is by Edmund Curley. It's first put forward in a paper in 1975. Regardless of whether it's conceptually impossible, direct stochastic voluntarism is false. If direct stochastic voluntarism is true, then people should be able to believe at will at least those propositions for which the evidence is not compelling. This incorporates the objection from the last one. It says, this is an issue over which there's not compelling evidence one way or the other. We're going to address that concern. Let us test the doctrine empirically. Consider the recent meteorological conditions on Jupiter. We do not have compelling evidence either confirming or disconfirming the proposition it rained 3 hours ago on Jupiter. Let's assume in 1975 we didn't have any satellites floating around Jupiter. We're living in 1975. Should we be able to form a belief at will about Jupiter and whether or not it rained there? Can you do that? No. Okay. I cannot form a belief about the proposition, and I contend that you can't either, unless you have very different minds than mine. Thus, there is at least one, and probably many other counterexamples, that claim that people have direct voluntary control over their beliefs. Therefore, regardless DDV is regardless of whether it's conceptually impossible, it's empirically false. Now, well, okay, obvious objections?
Yeah, that's a logical fallacy. It's a false dichotomy.
Why?
Because it doesn't have to be an either or thing. We can say that in that case you can't necessarily form the belief about Jupiter, but that doesn't mean in all cases you can't form it.
No, you're right. It says right here, there's at least one, and probably many other, and you can clear counterexamples.
But the claim for DDV isn't that we have control over every belief, but the control that we might have control over at least one.
Right, which is why this is a weaker argument, because it's an empirical argument. It runs into a black swans issue. You know, all swans are white. Well, I don't know, are they? They were until what? New Zealand, Australia, because we found black swans. Objections. Critics grant that some propositions for which we can have no evidence and can't form voluntary beliefs. So that's you made the obvious point. There's black swan's objection, but you can't possibly show that direct stochastic voluntarism is false because it doesn't examine all cases of belief. So there might be some beliefs for which we might have direct voluntary control. And one example would be a vindication of the entire concept, because then it makes the concept valid. We have one example of it, so it's true for this one example. Okay, so then the question becomes, well, are there any arguments for direct stochastic voluntarism? Are there any examples? So then we start coming into arguments for direct stochastic voluntarism. The two most common ones in the literature are the observability argument and the action analogy argument. We're going to do the observability argument. This most recent, it was put forward by Carl Gennett. Anybody? People can will to believe a proposition given that there is inconclusive evidence. So we're still on the issue of inconclusive evidence. Everyone agrees that when the evidence is really strong on an issue one way or the other, we don't have control over that. But when there's not strong evidence one way or the other, for example, God, that's what everybody wants this to be the issue on. The argument's over things for which there's not a lot of good evidence for or against. So, two examples. These are a little lengthy, but Before Sam left his office this morning, Sue asked him to bring into his office a particular book she needs for preparing a lecture next day on his way back home. Sue wonders whether Sam will remember to bring the book. She recalls that he has sometimes, though not often, forgotten such things. Sam can be forgetful. But given the thought that her continuing to wonder whether he'll remember to bring the book will make her anxious all day, she decides to stop fretting. She decides to stop fretting and decides to believe that he will remember to bring the book she wanted. That's the framing of the observability argument. This is an example, they say, of an example of somebody deciding to believe. This is the context of the situation. The other example. We've started on a trip by car, and 50 miles from home, Amanda asked me if I locked the front door. And I think I did, but I don't have a clear, detailed, confident memory impression of locking that door. I'm aware that my unconfident memory impressions have sometimes been mistaken. Right? And that's true. But given the great inconvenience of turning back, I'm already an hour away from the house, and the undesirability of worrying about it while continuing on, I decide to continue on and believe that I did lock it. Now, what are some objections to these? Anybody?
It's not really choosing to believe,
Right.
it's choosing action.
Right.
Choosing to put it out of your mind.
Choosing to put it out of your mind, but it's not necessarily choosing to believe. Okay.
You know, I don't think that all belief is the same. Like, belief and non-belief in my mind is not like black and white.
Right.
It's like,
it's on a scale.
If anybody that used to be a Christian remembers that belief they had in God, it wasn't the same kind of belief as that you think that it's going to be daylight the next day.
Well, the question then becomes,
it's absolutely some kind of wishful thinking, kind of mixture of thoughts that you call belief, but it's not the same belief as something that you know is
okay.
Like the sun's going to come up
tomorrow. But then the question
it's a different
becomes,
belief. So it's different levels of belief or different kinds of belief or something, and we're all calling it belief. And I think that's where we're, that's where you get all these variations of thought.
Philosophy is much about clarifying our terms. So, is that belief that you're talking about, that different kind of Christian belief, is that the kind of belief over which we have control? Conscious, voluntary control.
Well, I mean, I guess you control whether you say you believe it, but it's kind of like the old, why don't in churches, why don't people pray for God to heal amputees? Because somewhere deep in their mind, they really know that it's not real, but so they don't ever pray for God to give the amputee a new arm, but they pray for somebody who it's medically possible for him to be healed. They'll pray for that, and they say they believe that God can heal him and everything like that. But I went to a church for a long time and never heard one group prayer praying for an amputee to get an arm back. Because nobody actually really believes it like they believe the sun's coming up tomorrow. It's a different belief.
There's a fun website called Why Doesn't God Heal Amputees?
When I was a believer, if you had asked me whether or not the sun was going to come up tomorrow, if you told me that one was untrue, that God didn't exist, or that the sun wasn't going to come up tomorrow, I would conclude that the sun wasn't going to come up tomorrow, if I knew absolutely that one of them wasn't true.
You had a question?
Would you
That's how
think it was
fact is.
weird to, if in church they said, okay, we're going to pray for God to give this guy's arm back, would you have been shocked by it? Oh, God, what's he doing that for? Whereas they're praying for somebody that's sick.
I'm going to take control over the conversation again and pass it on to you for a second. You had a question?
What's the difference between belief and hope?
Belief and hope.
Belief is wishful
There's a
thinking.
lot of literature on that in philosophy of religion. Hope, faith, piety, belief.
Wishful thinking is, in my mind, belief in God is basically wishful thinking.
That's a debating question, the relationship between belief and hope. The question then becomes, is hope something over which is hope something that can give us beliefs? And that's kind of that's a deep question to the debate we're having. Yes.
I was just going to mention that these words, like belief, they have a lot of different meanings, and you know, believe can mean I believe it, or it can mean, well, you know, I believe I left the light, you know, I locked the door when I left, but you know, you might use that, have that usage. So it's like, you know, the multiple number definitions of the word it can have.
Yeah.
And it's ambiguous because of that.
You're right, and we will get back to that in just a minute, because we will be getting into a direct argument by a philosopher who defines belief in a different way. Okay, so Ginnett argues that a person believes a proposition when he or she stakes something on its truth. So they put something on, they put a bet on the table, they put something on the line on whether or not it's true. Ginnett is following within the tradition of a guy by the name of William James. He's a very famous American philosopher, popularized the pragmatism school, which is about the only uniquely American thing that ever came out of philosophy. And I'm not denigrating American philosophy, I'm just, that's our little claim to fame. Ginnett's following under that tradition. He says, believes a proposition when somebody puts something on the line, when they take an action, when they put an action based on that proposition, which seems reasonable at face value, but it'll come up here in a second in objections. So in the first case, Sue decided to believe Sam will bring the book so she can stop fretting. She put something on the line. In the second case, I decided to believe I locked the door so I could continue on my trip unconcerned. In both cases, someone stakes something on the proposition by the force of the will. If Sue had called to make sure, she would have staked something on the proposition Sam will not bring the book, and I would have staked something on the proposition I did not lock the door if I had turned around and gone back. Either way, the person took an action on a proposition they willed to stake something on. Therefore, direct stochastic voluntarism is something we can observe. You were talking about beliefs being the whole, I believe it, and it's almost like a physical, it's something you act upon. And this guy's arguing that's all a belief is. A belief is just something we're willing to stake to act upon. And that's a compelling definition, but there are objections to it. People do have experiences where they have anxiety about the truth of a proposition when the evidence is ambiguous. People do alleviate their anxiety by electing to act as if the proposition is true or false. Critics argue that what is happening in these cases is not belief, it's choosing to act as if. That's why we have that phrase in the English language.
It seems like that's more based on likelihood, and that's based on evidence. What have I done in the past? Have I been forgetful in the past?
Sure.
That, to me, it doesn't really... Like,
Well, and both they had the Sam example. Sometimes Sam forgets, but she chose in this case based on the likelihood that she thought Sam wouldn't forget to go one way or the other. She chose to act as if, but in this case, the objection is that's not the same thing as belief. Acting as if something's true is not the same thing as believing that it's true.
The problem with the staking something on it, though, is there's various degrees of what you're staking.
Right.
Like, you're not risking very much by not turning around. You know?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Now, there's two ways to approach this. First, someone might be able to rebut Ginnett's argument by showing that the kind of cases to which Ginnett refers are cases not of believing a proposition, but of accepting a proposition. And they draw a distinction between accepting something and believing it. According to this line of rebuttal, the person understands the proposition and decides to act as if the proposition is true for some practical reason. And Michelle, and that's a good example of that. But unlike cases of believing, the person neither affirms nor denies the proposition. Now this gets back to our original definition of belief, where we said that someone is affirming the truth value of a claim. They're accepting to act as if it's true, but they're not necessarily affirming the truth value of the claim.
With belief in God, there's another layer to that, you know, belief or not belief, because God's going to be pissed off at you if you don't believe. So you have this kind of you're acting that you believe, and you kind of believe, but you're afraid to really look into whether you believe it or not, because you're afraid God will read your mind and zap you or something, you know. So
that will come up again here in a minute. That's a good thought. We'll reference that again. Second approach. Someone might be able to rebut Gennett's argument by showing that the kind of cases to which he refers are cases not of believing a proposition but acting as if the proposition is true. That sounds a lot like the last one, but it's not the same thing. He's talking about accepting a proposition. This is just acting as if it's true. Person decides as if the proposition is true for some practical purpose, regardless of whether the person understands the proposition and of whether he or she affirms it, denies, or suspends judgment about the proposition. So, see this, and the last one, they were using a different word between accept and affirm, and in this one they said that doesn't matter, it's just acting as if, which I find the more compelling of the two. All right, William James. We're almost done here, so William James. Like I said, he's a very influential guy. He was a pragmatist. He wrote a really famous book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which was a foundational text for philosophy, particularly, or for psychology. Had a lot of influence in the American psychological tradition, especially as a reaction against an alternative to Freud. That's correct, yes?
A little bit later. Freud was writing on religion a little bit later.
Okay, all right. But James was very influential, not just in psychology, but also in philosophy. He had an essay called The Will to Believe. Did anybody read this before we came? I posted. Nobody? Ah, yes. All right. It comes up a lot in conversations with people who are fairly well read in philosophical tradition of religion, particularly Protestants. They like their William James a lot because he was one of them. You know, the Catholics always like to quote Aquinas and Augustine and what's his name, Leibniz. But William James comes up in the American Protestant tradition a lot. He's one of the guys I go to, and his essay, The Will to Believe, is an attempt to salvage Pascal's wager, as he admits that it doesn't work as it's written. And his attempt to salvage Pascal's wager, he talks about categories of options we have whenever we come up with a proposition. We have live and dead options. So if a proposition is a live option, it's a proposition that we can grasp onto. So for example, you were saying that if somebody gave you a choice between the sun rising tomorrow and God existing, you would believe that God existed and the sun wasn't going to come up tomorrow. Because for you, God not existing was not a live option.
Correct.
It was a dead option. It was just not, it was not on the table as something that you would consider a possibility. Then there's forced and avoidable. Avoidable decisions are decisions about, let's see, for example, the Jupiter thing. We're not forced to make a decision about that. We don't have evidence for it, and it's not really relevant to our lives. Whether or not God exists, James argues, at least for people in the Protestant Christian tradition, it's a forced choice. And Christianity frames it to be a forced choice. Because if you don't believe, if you choose not to accept the truth of it, you're going to hell. You're either going to hell or you're not. And so it's a forced choice, and it's trivial or momentous. And it's momentous because you're going to hell or you're not. And you know, those are kind of self-explanatory. So, will to believe. Genuine option is one that is living, forced, and momentous. And William James argued that at least for people in America, the God of Protestant Christianity was a genuine option for most people. I think we would all agree it is a genuine option for most people. It's something that is a living option for them. It's on the table of whether or not it's true. It's forced, both culturally and just by the way the Christians have framed the question. And it's momentous. Hell, heaven, afterlife. For James, the existence of the Christian God is an example of a genuine option. James admits that for many people it's not, because it's not a living option. For most Muslims, Christianity is not a living option. For most of us in this room, Christianity is not really a living option. Most of us really couldn't come to believe Christianity again. James argues that live and dead options language helps us understand why Pascal's wager only works for religions we are already inclined to find reasonable. That's his way of salvaging Pascal's wager. Because one of the objections to Pascal's wager is, okay, well, I'll just be a Muslim. Well, their hell's every bit as bad, if not worse, than yours. Right? So, this is his way of getting around that. Well, Islam's not a live option for most people in the United States. But Christianity is for most people in the United States. So you can salvage Pascal's wager by saying, well, for questions that are live options, I see some quizzical, wait a minute, this seems squirrely looks on people's faces out there. I think so too. But we'll get to it. This is why you should go read this essay. There are some great quotes in this essay. The talk of believing by our volition seems then from one point of view simply silly. From another point of view it's worse than silly. It is vile. Free will and simple wishing do seem in the matter of our crudeness to be only fifth wheels to the coach. He's got a good way with words. The guy's a good writer and he writes in English. Most philosophers either don't write in English or are terrible writers or both. He wasn't either. He was great. Go read this essay. It's like 13 pages. It's not that long. For a philosophical essay, that's not that long. You can read it in like 15 minutes. There are passional tendencies and volitions which run before and others which come after belief, and it is only the latter that are too late for the fair. And this is his passional tendencies and volitions which run before. This is the relevant quote for James. He's saying that we have these passions, these, for example, ways of seeing the world, and these desires, wants, and hates, and loves, and we have volition, and when we combine these things, that allows us to make decisions about whether or not, that allows us to make decisions about choices, about beliefs. James argues that we cannot will to believe dead options. That only makes sense. Those are the kinds of options which evidence for us is overwhelming. He then claims that we can will to believe live options, especially when there are non-trivial cases like the existence of God. James argues these cases where decisions are forced, where doing nothing is making a choice, and he says Christianity is one of those. I actually agree with him that Christianity is a forced option. I just don't agree with him that it's, I just don't like his live and dead language. James posits a situation where access to the evidence of the truth of a claim is only available when someone already believes the claim. Read that. Access to evidence of the claim is only available when you already believe it. A lot of people in Christianity claim this. Well, if you become a Christian, you'll see that what I'm saying is true.
We do it too.
We
do it too.
Give an example.
Scientific method.
Access to evidence of the truth.
You can only believe in the scientific method is true
when you already believe.
When you already believe in the science.
If you don't believe the premises of science, of the foundational principles of scientific method, you're right. Then you can't come to believe those things. That's a good example. You have to come to believe that the foundational axioms of science are true to believe this. That's a good example. And then he gives an example of tasks that require confidence. So, if I believe that I can win the basketball game, it makes me more likely to win the basketball game. So that's actually an interesting example. He points at something that's interesting there. It's kind of the placebo effect of sports and medicine and things like that, where believing that you can win actually affects the outcome. And there's an icky kind of iffy thing about how do you get to that place, and what kind of evidence. More evidence you have, the less likely you are to believe that. So James never actually puts forward, in my opinion, a coherent argument for voluntarism. He seems to think that voluntary beliefs are those formed after deliberating an option that is living, momentous, and forced. Look at that. Okay. He seems to think that voluntary beliefs are those that are formed after deliberating an option that is living, momentous, and forced. But the question is, that's just a way of rewording the definition of voluntary. It says it has no bearing on consciousness, whether or not we consciously come to believe something. Consciousness is an important element in the issue of whether or not something's voluntary. Voluntary beliefs are those formed after deliberating, which we all agree is conscious, options that is living, momentous, and forced. But you can deliberate an option, have that impact because you come to, okay, let me give you an example. Sorry, it's iffy. Let's say that I am deliberating the truth of a new scientific theory. I can't will myself to come believe the truth of that scientific theory, but if I sit down and think about it hard enough, I can come up with possible objections to it or problems with it. And then come to realize, after deliberating it, that it is more or less likely, just upon reflection. James is assuming that that means that we can will ourselves to believe something. But that is qualitatively different, in my opinion, than willing to believe something and just reflecting upon a question and realizing, having things pop into your head that are potential objections or evidence for it, examples for or against it. Yes? Does that make sense?